Insights and Inklings, a closer look at the Declaration of Contraband. How many of you have ever been to one of these panels? Excellent. Good, excellent. How many of you saw Butler? Okay, good, excellent, excellent. Well, we're so happy that you're here today. I'm going to give you a few pieces of information before we get started. This is a very important week for us because our forums are kicking off this week, and this is our first panel, and you are joining us for it, and we're really glad that you're here for this. We have many panels scheduled throughout the next 3 productions. We have 3 more panels for this show. We have a panel for My Name is Asher Lev, and then we have panels scheduled for Alabama Story. We also kicked off our online forum with guest writers, and some of those people are here in this room today. We hope that you join the discussion at the website, which is listed inside your forum program. At the bottom right-hand side there, it says Join the Conversation Online. So please go there to see what we're doing and what events are happening throughout our forums. It is my great pleasure to introduce this gentleman to my left. This is Chief Judge Charles E. Williams. I'm sure that you have seen him many times if you have attended these panels. And this is a very important time for us because without Chief Judge Williams' help and guidance and exploration through the topics, we would not have the depth of these panels. So it is a very, very welcomed appreciation to have him here. Yes, please, express your, yes. I would now like to go ahead and introduce the panel guests and have them arrive through this beautiful set that you see here. Gentlemen, if you could join us on stage. Thank you. Go ahead and have a seat. We'll make introductions. Seated next to Chief Judge Williams, we have Dr. Brendan Goff, who is an associate professor. Assistant professor. Give me time. Okay. All right, everybody starts somewhere at New College. Seated next to him, we have Shane Taylor, who is playing Shepard Mallory in the production of Butler. Yes. And this distinguished gentleman right here is Jason Cannon. He is an associate artist for Florida Studio Theater, as well as the director of Butler. Let's talk about the format for today. The first 30 minutes, we will have questions that Chief Judge Williams will lead with our panel guests. We'll do that for about maybe 25, 30 minutes. Then at that point, we will go ahead and we will open up questions to you in the audience. We ask that you ask questions that are succinct and questions as opposed to observations. And then we will have a handheld mic that will get to you so we can hear your questions and address those. All right, let's go ahead and turn this over to our moderator.
Okay, and the good news is it looks like most of you have seen the play, and what we'd like to do is really sort of talk about the play in terms of the historical perspective and in terms of the characters and maybe their development a little bit. Dr. Goff, who is a historian, I'm going to direct the first question to, and it's pretty general and broad, but I think it's important. Dr. Goff, as a historian, what was your basic impression of the play?
Well, I guess I tried to come into the play without too many expectations, which is hard to do when you have a lot of expectations, historical and otherwise. But I think I really was trying to force myself to be an audience member first and not a critic per se, because this is a moment in time now. It's a performance now about the past, but it's in the present. So I in my mind, I kind of want to respect that as an audience member. But at the same time, having read a reasonably amount of material on the topic and having taught on the topic before also, the teacher in me and the scholar in me kind of starts
Right.
editing and commenting and so forth. So.
Well, getting a little bit more specific in terms of the historical significance of this issue of contraband and property as it related to slavery. When we look back on it at 2016, it seems kind of silly, but back in 1861, why was this issue so important and so critical and so key to so many things dealing with slavery?
I think because, first of all, the events that the play is built on, those events were so soon, right at the very beginning of the war, and so the appearance of these 3 slaves at Fort Monroe and Butler's legal innovations with respect to that, resulting in the application of this term contraband, that it was a very, in some ways, something like that was inevitable, right? That kind of moment where you have runaway slaves showing up at a federal installation saying, or actually demanding, I did see the play, I did see the play, making their demands on General Butler. And that's actually, you get a lot of laugh lines from the play, actually, from this. But in fact, I think that's really, now that I think about it more, it's one of the central points of both the play and of that moment, in that the slaves were making demands, not just on the soldiers of Fort Monroe and on General Butler, but on the U.S. federal government. In the spring of 1861, weeks after, I think it was weeks after Fort Sumter. And so the term contraband was a very strategic, clever word that covered a whole history of lies and violence and political agreements that were very messy at the ground level. And so the term contraband covered all of that, and yet at the same time it captured the kind of insanity of it all and the surreal absurdities that went into that historical moment and into a slave society or a nation that was half free and half slave. All right. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. The issue of slaves being human beings had been decided by some Supreme Court cases by Dred Scott. So we had come to this point in 1861 where there really hadn't been a definition of what a slave was except for property or contraband. Is that a fair assessment?
Right, but I mean, both as property and as non-citizen, and in fact as non-person, the two went hand in hand. The term, legal property being applied to a human being had a long history, long before obviously 1861, or before the Dred Scott decision. But the entire kind of social, political, economic apparatus or systems that were built on the commodification and valuation of human beings as things with a price, with a market value, and with a labor value. It had kind of really matured to a rather really amazing degree of sophistication by the late 1850s. One of the things I just want to say is that, the common myth, and this comes out in Edward Baptist's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, is that one of the most powerful myths in American history that we all run around and we're kind of taught and we just kind of pick up through osmosis is that, slavery by the 1840s, 1850s, this was a vestigial thing. This was dying out, and that's simply not true. 2/3 of the world's cotton was being produced out of the South in 1860. And there's a reason why Southern plantation owners were so confident that they could pull off this War of Secession, because I really felt that at that point they had that much leverage, not just with respect to the North and with respect to westward expansion or even expansion in the Caribbean, but also with respect to global capital markets, London, Berlin, Paris, let alone Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, as places where they could go get loans and get very sophisticated, quite literally mortgage-backed securities. These financial innovations come from the 19th century, and much in the way of servicing the advancement of that form of capitalism. All right.
I'd like to ask Jason Cannon, first of all, what attracts you to this play? And there's so many complicated issues with the play, this issue of contraband, the morality of slavery. What do you see this play saying to the audience, or what do you want the audience to feel or think about when they leave this play?
Start with a hard one, Coach.
Yeah. We don't mess around here.
Yeah. What's interesting here is that in my role as director and an artist, I can't direct to theme. You end up with polemic or with preaching, and no one wants to watch that. That's not what you pay for a ticket for, to come and be preached at or be led by the nose. When I first read the play a couple years ago, what struck me was, one, kind of fun fact, I didn't know any of this stuff. Two, how the playwright so wisely used humor to help us approach this incredibly delicate topic. And then three, what really struck me is that even though Butler dominates the text, he's in every scene, he never leaves the stage, the title is his name, this character of Shepard Mallory is what made the play work for me. And in a strange way, this character of Shepard Mallory is a very modern character, contemporary. Remember when Shane and I were first talking, I said, hey, like, if Tupac emerges, that's okay. If hip hop rhythms come into some of your line readings, that's okay. If modern sensibility, because Shepard Mallory, as he says, if I was white and you were black, I would be a major general and you would be a slave. The chance of circumstance, and the only way to kind of make the history present is to see it through a present. I mean, you said it yourself. It's a present event, a present day event that we can't help but see through a prism colored by Ferguson, colored by everything that we've been hearing in the news the last year. So for me, the thing I had to focus on was the story that the playwright has provided. Trust the playwright's research, trust the playwright's instincts in what to include, what to not include, what to perhaps alter, for the sake of the story, to drive home the point. For me, it's the final image, these three men together, drinking together, to contraband, to not knowing what is going to happen, but facing it side by side. If there's a single lasting image, it is that last image of the play, I hope.
Now, I'm going to ask Shane to channel his inner Miles Davis, because he may have to freelance a little bit on this. Playing a slave for an African American, not only watching an African American playing a slave is very complex. There's a lot of complexity in the emotion. As an audience member, not even being African American, anyone watching someone portray a slave, you are obviously the key role in this play. How do you prepare yourself, number one, psychologically, to play this role night after night in a way that is respectful to the people who are watching the play, especially African Americans, and true to the characters? So I know that's kind of a broad question, but I just wanted to know what your process was and how you feel personally playing this character.
Oh, that's a good, loaded question.
Join the club.
I know, right? Thanks for having me. Well, I mean, I must say that I was very, very sensitive about not wanting to offend audience members and not wanting to make a fool of myself in the process. And so I approached it as if I was honoring the past, being thankful for the opportunity to tell this young man's story in a way that was truthful and that was honest. In a way, it felt weirdly familiar to me. I don't know if we can attribute that to this idea of blood memory, or this idea of, our ancestors' experiences being tied to our DNA, or that because in the way that Richard Strand has written this character, it seems very and feels very, very contemporary. So it didn't feel far from my experience, my own personal experience as a black man living in America today. And I'm not in any way comparing my experience to Shepard Mallory's and his compatriots, but certainly I've lived through some diversity, some adversity, and challenges that I was able to bring to this experience. I was just grateful to have the opportunity to portray a character that wasn't a stereotype, because oftentimes we've seen this character in all forms of our media, and they don't look like or appear like Shepard Mallory. And that was one of the main things that really excited me, the way I imagined this man carried himself, the way I imagined that he walked, that he lived in the world. Excited me because he was sort of outside of the box and outside of the realm of what we're used to seeing in regards to images of African Americans within history. So,
Let me ask Jason, when you direct Shane, are you thinking in terms of how you want the audience to view him in terms of the sensitivity of being a slave? Does that come into your thought process when you're directing?
For this one, it really didn't. I was more concerned about Shane feeling like he was tapping into what he needed to tap into. On the very first day of rehearsal, I pulled Shane aside and told him, "You're off the chain." By which I mean he could do whatever he wanted to the other actors without harming them. But to surprise the other actors, that I didn't want to. I mean, Shane is being very sensitive, like he doesn't want to, conflate his experience with someone like, look at me, I'm not going to dare conflate my experience with, I'm not going to tell him how to play that role. What I can tell him, though, is what the story needs. And what the story needed was an enslaved man who was fighting against that with every tool and weapon he could possibly get his hands on. A man with incredible empathy and humor and insight, a natural leader. Something actually that our artistic director, Richard Hopkins, said as we were talking about this play was that something that struck him was how clearly this crystallized the fact that African Americans completely see through and understand white people, but white people are clueless about what goes on in the minds of the African Americans. And I loved how Shane tapped into the mask thing and how he can play a role to fool and to get what he needs. And so when I wanted to give Shane as much space to explore what he needed. And then as a director, I can fine tune the story based on what happens in the rehearsal room. When the actor Eric reacts to Shane, we can choose which reaction is most effective to tell the story. But as far as trying to shape that experience for him, no way.
In terms of the history of the subject matter, Shane, did you do anything special to prepare for this role?
Sure, I did a lot of research, primarily reading a few books. One was called Freedom's First Generation, primarily focuses on African Americans in the Hampton, Virginia area at the dawn of the Civil War. So that gave me a lot of context, along with Adam Goodhart's book, 1861. Just informed me about the environment in which these individuals existed at that time.
And I'm going to go back to Dr. Goff. Historically, this play takes place in 1861, May of 1861 at Fort Monroe. As a historian, what's significant about Fort Monroe militarily and historically?
Before I answer that question, real quick, the comment about allowing Shane or rather conveying Shepard Mallory's character and just how he was trying to pull on every single lever, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, to advance the cause of freedom for his own life and for his compatriots, and as it turns out, for his family and many other slaves in the area. And I think that's really telling because, again, even though the play's called Butler and it's all about General Franklin Butler, but it's at the center of the story is the agency of the slaves themselves and the fact that they were forcing the issue, right? And so that kind of that's a segue to the question is. I think Goodhart points this out in his book that that Fort Monroe, where it's located in Virginia, is very, very close to where the first slave ship came in 1620. So it's not just any old federal military installation. It's Fort Monroe, and a military installation of some sort had been there since the early days of Jamestown, and it just so happened to be the place where a Dutch ship would come in and looking to sell, in that case in 1620, X number of slaves. I think it was about 20 slaves. But even though that's the first time in North American history that you have the selling of slaves, you don't really have the modern, recognizably modern understanding of slavery as white owners and black slaves. You don't really get that until the 1660s, 1670s, 1680s, and that model is coming in from the Caribbean. The legislative model, the slave codes, especially coming from Barbados, and it's especially in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion, where you have the close, intimate political construction of American slavery and American freedom, and the two going hand in hand, which is again why, with the presence of those three slaves showing up on Butler's doorstep, that it forced the issue. And much in the same way that the Southerners were trying to force the issue during the 1840s and 1850s, and trying to basically roll back the Missouri Compromise of 1820 with the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act and Kansas-Nebraska Act and all the other good stuff, Dred Scott decision. Yes. So it's a very precise time and place, a very specific historical moment, but in fact, just spatially, let alone narratively, it goes in so many different directions. And again, that's why that word contraband is such a deceptively simple term.
And I know that we're going to go to the audience in a few moments, but I want you to, and I know we could probably talk for hours on it, but just briefly address the economic importance of slavery. We talk about it in terms of moral issues, but just if you could just give the audience an idea of how economically important this institution was and why, as we see in Butler, it was so important to get slaves back and why slavery was such a big issue.
Can I answer that?
Please, yes.
No, I mean that's the thing is that the moral. I don't want to assume, but I mean, for all the moral arguments behind it, abolitionism was a significant force in American history, certainly by the 1850s. But at the same time, there was a realization that. General Butler was one of the first to realize this, but there were others, that, for example, that map hanging behind us, which was the first thing I noticed as an audience member coming in, that map hanging there, and this comes out in the play a little bit also, that, it's not just that there's a simple calculus of slaves lost to the South means a loss of free labor, forced, coerced labor, but still free labor for the South, but also a net gain for the federal, for the U.S. Army in particular, and the U.S. government in general, in 1861, and by 1864, 1865, you have famously, I think it's up to something like 10% of the U.S. Army is African American soldiers at that point. You were talking about 180,000 plus soldiers by the end of the war. And so there's a slow realization that that what those 3 slaves represented. In fact, I forgot to mention this before, that was not the first time that you had runaway slaves coming to a federal military installation, because in March of 1861, at Fort Pickens in Pensacola, you had 8 runaway slaves that did the exact same thing, and there was no General Butler there, and they ended up being sent back to the local sheriff and never heard from again. So it's not like that was the first time ever, but that was the first time that it forced the issue, especially because of the proximity to, Virginia. So the point is, I guess, that over the course of from 1861 to 1865, there's a growing, often grudging realization on the part of many Northerners that this slave labor made possible that slave society, and that if the U.S. government was to survive, let alone the U.S. Army to win the war, that they needed to be brought in, their labor needed to be brought in, their fighting needed to be, their service as soldiers became crucial by 1865 to this self-identity of the United States. And it's hard to, it comes out in the play a little bit as in terms of helping with fortifications and military intelligence. Another quick little fun fact is that there weren't really any up-to-date maps of the South in the 1850s and going into 1860, 61. There wasn't, in fact, Pinkerton, the top intelligence master under Lincoln, when he traveled incognito through the South, he got his information. I think Goodhart goes into this. He would get most of his valuable information, lay of the land, where to go, where not to go, where rivers go, and bridges, and recently built railroads, and so all the stuff that an invading force would need to know about. By far the most valuable information, by far the most valuable military intelligence came from local slaves who were more than eager to help out. So it's not just brawn, and it's not just the net loss of labor from one side to the other, but also 1/5 of the wealth of the United States was located in the slaves themselves, and the valuation of their human body. So again, those 3 runaway slaves quite literally embodied the most powerful act of subversion possible to the entire system.
Catherine, you want to turn it over to the audience now?
Sure. What I'd like to do before we actually open it up for questions is also touch on something that Jason brought up. He kind of gave us a nice segue into the next panel and the topic that we will talk about, which is titled The Masks We Wear. And that's going to be a look at the Paul Dunbar poem and how that relates to the characters in Butler. And Shane, you'll be joining us for that as well. So hopefully you can make that as well. That's February 18th, which is in a couple weeks. Also, I just want to point out that we have a very important person here today, which is one of our steering committee members. And Michelle Redwine is here, and she has been involved with the forums last year, and now this year she's on the steering committee. So I just want to recognize that she is here. The steering committee is an important part of what we do here, and Chief Judge Williams is the chair of that committee. And with Mayor Shaw and Tom Tryon from the Herald Tribune, and Trevor Harvey, the president of the local chapter of the NAACP, we have a very strong steering committee that gets us to this point. All the planning that goes into these moments are done by those people. So I'd like to recognize them. Yes, you can applaud for them. And we have another cast member in the house, too, and Jim Sorensen is here, and he is up in the back. And we want to give him recognition, too, because, yes, he is also instrumental in helping us get things to where they are. So,
and Catherine, if I could say one thing.
Go ahead.
Shane and Jim yesterday, very nicely on their behalf, spoke to some students at Booker High School about the play who will be coming to see the play. And so I just want you to know they really appreciated that, and we really thank you for doing that. Yes,
and they came today to see the show, so it was great to have them have that bit of information before they came here. So thank you for doing that. A special thank you to Charles Clapsaddle and METV, and they are the people here making these videos and sound, and they will post these on their website, and we appreciate what they do for us as well because they help the word get out even farther. So thank you, Charles, and your team. Thank you for being here. Okay, let's open up some questions. Again, if we could get nice, succinct questions, and if you would tell us who that question is for, so we can get to the matter of your question.
This is for the director. Most of the dialogue is spoken at a very high volume, except for the southern officer. Why was that?
We don't use body mics in this space. It's an intimate space. We do have, you can probably see them, a couple cloud mics that hang just to capture and fill in some gaps. But to project to that back row and for clarity, and just to make sure that, you know, our audience skews a bit more mature. And we want to make sure that every word is caught. So it's funny because usually the complaint is the exact opposite. But it's all about clarity. It's all about getting the story to that back row in the back corner.
Nothing to do with military life.
Well, not specifically, no. I mean, if there was a character who embodied that the most, it would have been Lieutenant Kelly, and you probably noticed that his speech was the most clipped and most directed, and that was part of his character, yes.
Good. Another question up there? I see a question.
Yeah. Right here. This is for Dr. Goff. I'm wondering if you could explain to us what percent of the Southern GDP was represented by the cotton trade, and further, what percentage, perhaps, of the Northern GDP was represented by finished cotton goods. So the loss, you know, what would that be?
I was going to look that up this morning. I am not kidding you. It was a significant amount. I can tell you this, for example, between 1802 and 1820, GDP went from 14% due to cotton to 42% due to cotton. That's from 1802 to 1820. That already gives you an indication. And like I said, 2/3 of the world's cotton by 1860 was coming out of the southern colonies, you know, or the southern states, right? But, you know, especially after the Civil War, you know, once the war is over, cotton production does return. But then it's formally under the aegis of control by Northern capital, right? So before the Civil War, you have this constant tug of war between the South and the North over a lot of things, but it's obviously slavery was at the center of that. For example, I'll give you a quick example also. In the 1830s, at the height of Jacksonian democracy, you have the Panic of 1837, which was horrible, right? And it just took over the country and nearly broke it apart in many ways. And that continued well into the early 1840s. Much of that was driven by the kind of debt that was being taken on in the South, both through land speculation and through the ownership of human beings. And the investors, many of the investors for that, were nice middle-class folk in upstate New York, for example. It would be through, and again through, you know, I think Baring Brothers, for example, and many London capitalists. So this is a function of global capitalism. It's not just a story about the United States. It's about global capitalism, global finance, and the centrality of stolen labor and the marketization of human bodies. And the increasing, there's another fact I can give you, it's not GDP, but by 1860, cotton production was about 22%. Hold on, let me get the number right. About 22 times more efficient than it had been in 1790. So again, it goes back to that myth that cotton production and slavery itself was somehow this kind of, you know, old way of being and an old form of labor that was on its way out. That's not true. That's not true. It's central to our one of our central myths, but as a nation. But it's not true. There's a reason why Southerners, whether they owned a plantation, whether they owned slaves or not, there's a reason why they were looking to force the issue, not just to have slavery in all of the West, but in fact through Dred Scott to in the Fugitive Slave Act to have it become federal law, whether you're in Vermont, New Hampshire, or Maine, as much as in Mississippi, Louisiana. I mean, they were pushing for that after Dred Scott. And it looked, for all intents and purposes, in 1859 and 1860 that they had gotten it, but for the 1860 election, a guy named Abraham Lincoln, but they were there. This was political overreach in the 1850s, not unlike the financial overreach of the 1830s, which led to the Panic of 1837.
I'm not sure who to direct this question at, and anyone who feels comfortable dealing with it. But how do we use the history of that time frame and the discussions from these forums to have a more positive impact on the racial issues we deal with today, which a lot of people don't want to talk about? But
I think that's tailor-made for Shane. So I'm going to ask you. How about you? No.
And his last name is Taylor. I mean, yeah.
I mean, therein lies the question, right? I mean, that's a million-dollar question right there, right? I mean, how do we put all of this into action? You know, these plays, these lectures, these debates, these forums. What do we do with it? How do we get beyond this moment? And to be quite honest, I'm not really sure. I mean, I thought a lot about that before coming here today. And I really just cannot come up with an answer for it.
Please. A couple nights ago, Stephen Colbert, on his show, had one of the leaders from the Black Lives Matter movement on his show. And I think it crystallized kind of, because I've had the exact same thought. What is next? And until there is a crystallizing moment, like in this play, there are so many forces at work, so much noise. I think what we have to consciously do is make the space for the conversation. What Stephen Colbert did, he asked this young African-American gentleman, Stephen Colbert said, "I'm the whitest guy you'll ever meet." And then he said, "What can I do? How can I be aware of my white privilege? And what actions can I take?" And the young man said, "You got to make space for the conversation. Even symbolic gestures can carry power if they are repeated enough." And Stephen Colbert got up and switched places and put himself into the interviewee chair and gave his desk, his national platform, to this young African-American man who kind of is one of the top 10 leaders voted by Time or something from Black Lives Matter. And they had a little short interview with a Black Lives Matter gentleman, asked Stephen Colbert, "What can you do about your white privilege?" And just kind of forced Stephen to think about and to answer as the person being asked and not just as the person controlling the conversation. If there's a moment for me during this play where that happened, it is when Kate Alexander mentioned this. I can't give credit where credit is due. I don't know who mentioned this to her, but
Eric.
you heard me use the word earlier. Who was it?
Are you going to talk about
Enslaved.
Eric Deggans? No, go ahead.
I don't. We toss that word slave around so cavalierly and don't realize how that controls the bodies. In fact, they were enslaved, which puts the onus on the right place. And earlier this evening, it's hard sometimes. It's so easy to say, "Oh, the slaves did this," or "We did this to slave." But no, an enslaved young man, he's not a slave. He is a smart, empathetic man with agency who happens to be enslaved by someone else, and that someone else is the problem, not this young man. So it's flipping the conversation. It's flipping that switch. And so to answer your question, I think those small things, they add up. And I think that's what part of this forum is trying to be part of that. When the crystallizing moment happens, when the three enslaved men, our moment of when someone's going to force it and someone on the ground is going to have that moment of insider genius, we can't control that, but what we can do is prepare for it as much as possible. That's all I'm trying to do, I guess. Did that sound at all as good as it was in my head? I don't know if it made sense. That was my best shot. I don't know.
If I could just tack on, we get that question all the time. But most people don't realize how difficult it is just to get a conversation going about race and sexism and religious bigotry. Just getting the conversation is important. But specifically on slavery, and this is one of the reasons that we really are glad that we have this historical perspective, is that it's starting to become to some people just a blip on America's history. And it's so much more than that. And I'm finding more and more about how important slavery was to the United States. There was an article that was written about a case for reparations, and everybody sort of laughed at that. How could you possibly think that African Americans should be granted reparations for slavery? But the more you read about how the United States profited from slavery, that argument becomes much stronger. That it wasn't just a moral issue, it was the economic engine that drove this country, that made, as our president said, America the most powerful nation on the earth. And so I think once you understand that from a historical perspective, you can start to think about what's going on today and why it still lingers and why we still have problems. But until you could talk about it, until you understand the history, it's really hard to move forward. And so that's one of the things that I've learned actually from watching this play, is this idea of human beings being considered property and contraband, and why that was so important. So just getting these conversations going, getting this interaction, I think does initiate some positive change.
That's why we're here today. Thank you.
I think that it did some of the good things. For example, we didn't talk about a name. The playwright did a great job at the beginning where they talked about, here's the slave, here's this. They didn't have a name. They didn't know the name. They didn't know the name for two scenes, right? We do that all the time. That's why we have gooks and geeks, and when we fight wars, we never call them whatever they are. We give them a name. So to identify the people and identify the conflict, it's better to give it a name. And it's one of the things we still don't do. And it's not just us whites. When we talk about that nobody black got an Academy Award this year, the blacks are talking about nobody black got Academy Award this year. You have names. Use the names. Talk about the people who are great and deserve the Academy Award by name, not generic.
Thank you. Another question?
I believe that most of the economic force that benefits of slavery went to just a few of the white slave owners. The majority of the Southerners did not benefit economically from the slaves. How do you explain the support that they gave in the war against slavery? I mean, for slavery, if they didn't really benefit directly.
That's for Dr.
For
Goff.
Dr. Goff, I'm sorry.
Well, in two ways I'd answer that. One is, in fact, they did. They did benefit. They may not have been formal owners of plantations, for example, but when the entire system is set up according to a racial hierarchy like that, to be white had its own vested interest, quite literally, and that's why, for example, in the 1820s and 1830s, what makes possible the opening or widening of the circle of citizenship to all white men, with or without property, is because of the slave society around them, because of the women and others disenfranchised around them. So the changing notions of citizenship over time are, and this is what I was trying to get back to with Virginia in the 1670s, for example, with that classic American paradox of American freedom and American slavery. To be white, with or without the ownership of slaves, to be white had its own value because we, as a nation, had decreed it as such over time. And so, in one sense, but that's kind of at the moral, political, somewhat abstract level. But also, quite literally, they even if you did not actually own human property, you could profit from the system itself because it was set up for a person. You could be a shoemaker, you could be, whatever, but still, you're in a community that's based on that fundamental reality and means of exploitation and theft of labor. At the other level, what was I going to say? What was your question again about the yeah, well, why they would, right, why would they support that? Because, and again, it gets into that notion of when you have a nation that has defined itself and defined its destiny, its origins, its terms of citizenship according to white supremacy, right? When that is the case, and that's a hard truth to wrap your mind around. It's not something you want to learn about, and it's not something that's taught in an American history textbook. But when that reality wraps itself around your mind, you really get that. Then you realize that it may not have been in the best economic interests of a small farmer who barely can get by and has no prayer of owning anyone or anything, a plow, let alone. Still, they're part of that system, and they saw it, many of them, as such. Now, at the same time, don't go thinking that, anyone who was, and everyone who was white in the South or in the North automatically thought that way. That's not true. It was very complex. It depended on the individual person, circumstances, and choices made, and so forth. But when the entire system is set up in that way, it's not a simple question of, I'm going to fight for the Confederacy because, or not, based on slave ownership, the status of slave ownership or not. Do you follow what I'm saying? It's much more systemic than that, and then also at the same time much more localized and contingent. Do you see?
Good. We have time for one more question.
I guess I'm on.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you up there.
Yeah.
Okay, and then go ahead.
Why did the European nations get out of the slave economic business in the 1820s? What wasn't working for them? Why wasn't slavery economically viable for the Europeans? And they just basically got out of that whole thing, not because they were such nice guys.
It sounds like it's from you. Well, they got out of it, but they didn't really get out of it. Because what they did was the British Empire formally abolished slavery. I want to say 1833. I should know this, 1834. But remember, for example, Brazil doesn't abolish slavery until 1888. There are forms of slavery throughout the Caribbean before and after the Civil War. And just because slavery as this economic, political, legal system is mapped onto a kind of imperial system, whether it's Spanish, French, British, Dutch, whatever, that just because there's a formal move away from that form of slavery doesn't mean that level of that kind of exploitation still doesn't occur. It just occurs in a different form. Witnessed within the United States, after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, Jim Crow continued, right? And so they're all within this context of ruptures, historical ruptures like this moment at Fort Monroe or the Civil War itself, or even Reconstruction. In some ways, there's some very deep, profound continuities over the centuries that run in the world of empires and nations and entire economic systems. And one of those is a form of race-based slavery and race-based exploitation. So even though it may not have been in the interest for the British Empire, especially given its self-image in the 1830s onward, to continue to have formal commitment or formal protection of that system of slave trade, it's still, the money's still being made, a lot of money in London, Manchester, Liverpool, through this cotton production, through the investment. So yeah, they formally ended, they formally banned the slave trade in one sense, but they continue to profit from it and identify and define the British Empire in very much a similar manner over time. So it's a great question, but yeah.
We had promised this gentleman down here for one last question.
Shane's willfulness, idiosyncratic nature, his power, and his determination played out well in this slice of time on stage. I wonder how that would play out today in Black Lives Matter.
How would that play out today? A similar situation, you mean, of?
Well, no, just as a public spokesperson, as someone with a sense of agency on behalf of, let's say, the African American community, with the same sort of
Going in with demands and
willfulness, idiosyncratic nature in some ways, determination. I wonder how it would play out today.
I think it is playing out.
It is good.
I think what people, actual humans like Shepard Mallory, who actually was 19 at the time he ran away and did this. The way Shane put it earlier, that I'll hand it up, giving voice to the voiceless, that Black Lives Matter today wouldn't be possible without, I mean, we're all standing on shoulders of shoulders of shoulders.
Sure. But those standing up now on the top level of those shoulders, are they trying to be more strategic? Have they chilled a little bit in relation to that? Will they get the national attention or political power that they want in the same embodiment of Shane, for example?
Well, I think the fight continues. I think it's an ongoing evolutionary experience. The struggle is, which has evolved into this movement of Black Lives Matter. I think what makes it special in Shepard Mallory's case is that it was sort of unique in that time. But now there's hundreds and thousands of Shepard Mallorys, and I think they're making a difference. I mean, I think they're gaining national attention, and they're moving the pens in government. So I just think it's more widespread now, these sort of experiences.
There were many in 1961 as well, actually.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Just a few other. Yes, thank you.
This one just works.
Thank you to our guests that have joined us today. Thank you again to METV for being here to film this. Thank you, Chief Judge Williams, for being our moderator. And we thank you, of course, for coming. We have a production of Butler in the space tonight, so we would ask that everybody would go ahead and exit to the lobby so that we can
Go get dressed, Shane.
get everybody set up. And again, we hope to see you on the next panel. Please check our website, and thank you very much.